Basically, a while back, PlayStation decided to introduce their whole game streaming concept themselves, called PlayStation Now, as a add-on to their already existing feature, PlayStation Plus, which is kind of their basically way of selling multiplayer, cloud storage, and a few other things on the side. Most people had it. I had it, but they also were asking people to buy into PlayStation Plus or PlayStation Now. My mistake. And I don't think it was going that well because maybe people just didn't want to buy into two different things at once. It was just too big of a drain on their finances. Plus, you had to manage two different subscriptions. So eventually, they decided to just roll the whole thing into one and make it a tiered system. You've got your basic PlayStation Plus now, which is basically PlayStation Plus as it was originally. You've got PlayStation like Plus, I think Gold, which basically is PlayStation Plus with the ability to stream the most recent games. Like you've got the most recent Assassin's Creed Valhalla there, a bunch of PS4 games and some PS5s. And then you've got PlayStation Plus Platinum, which has all these features of the previous two, as well as the ability to stream old classic games from PS3 and back. So, for example, like I said in that previous video, I'm using it currently to play the Sly Cooper series over again because I remember playing them for the PS2, PS Vita when that was a thing, and even played Themes in Time, which I enjoyed. It wasn't the best game in the world, but I enjoyed it. So I'm replaying the Sly Cooper series finally, and it's interesting. Like I said, I've had mixed experiences with it, but again, go to that video for more. Should have linked it if I knew I was going to talking about, but whatever. But yeah, that's the long and short about PlayStation's attempt at game streaming. All in all, not bad. Would I call it better than Google Stadia though? Yes. um, not well. Actually, oh no. If I'm gonna be honest, I truly can't speak to the quality of how Stadia performs because I never bought into Stadia. Chiefly because of the reason I previously mentioned, I really didn't think Google was gonna stick with the idea, which in truth be told, they didn't. So I guess that was a well-founded assessment on my part. But all in all, again, Justin is right in many ways. You're right. There is going to be a future in the market for game streaming because that's the new recent scheme that the game companies have come up with, right? Netflix did it with movies, so why not gaming, right?
Yeah.
At least that's the basic logic everyone's working under. And with this kind of new idea comes a whole bunch of new companies into the market trying to profit off of the games industry. And again, there's this whole shtick you can go into about how the games industry in general has over the last decade and a half kind of been seen more professionally and less as a joke, so to speak, which is why you've got companies like Amazon and the aforementioned Google coming into the picture now. Companies which some would argue, myself potentially, that they have no business being in the games industry because they have no idea what they're doing. Not saying they can't, but in their current state, they really shouldn't. But again, it is what it is. Google with Stadia was kind of the first person to kind of kick off the trend. And again, I mention that because Google's intervention into the market really did open the floodgates for all these kind of megacorps to come into the market. Like I said, now we've got Amazon in the market. We've got Facebook Gaming, which I'm not even going to go on about. Like you've got all these other companies who are kind of entering the market who really in the past, like, this is not their thing. The only reason they're doing it is because Google kind of showed that a company could go into the market. Now, how successful their entry into the market is a point of debate, but still. But again, that's a whole other topic for a whole other conversation. Google Stadia itself, in retrospect, like I said, this was going to happen. In fact, this was actually something we were talking about, me and Justin, over on Destiny for a little bit, because there was actually constant announcements because Google Stadia was shutting down, so the Destiny version of Google Stadia, or the Google Stadia version of Destiny, also went with it. So for anyone who's playing Destiny primarily on Stadia, they had to do some crossplay to save their account data, so they could start playing it somewhere else. Otherwise, they'd lose everything. So for those people who were playing games like that and lost information because of it,
I
I
mean,
don't know.
like a game like Destiny, the devs
Hmm.
did give a warning at least.
Yeah, they did give
But
pretty fair warning, and I think most people did, but
yeah,
I don't know if Warframe was on it. So if you had a Warframe account, I don't know if it's on Stadia. Hold on, let me check that. I don't think they ever did go to Stadia. Maybe. Warframe is a very like heavy, intensive game to get into. So if you lost that account,
hmm.
yikes. I know they don't have cross save yet. They have crossplay. They're working on cross save. So let me just check that. Now I'm curious. Hmm. Doesn't look like it. Everyone was just wondering if it would. So at least that's one bullet they kind of dodged. Overall, like I said, this was bound to happen eventually. Google's such a big company that they usually don't stick with a project too long that's hemorrhaging money. Though, in fairness, they did stick with it longer than I think a lot of people thought they would. Why do you think that is, Justin? Any ideas?
I have a feeling probably because of the whole streaming service to begin with, and how
Mm,
it's been very successful.
yeah, it's possible they were just trying to hop on a bandwagon and they thought if they could make it work, they could make it work and make tons of cash. The
Hmm.
problem is they couldn't make it work.
Yeah,
Now, I
wasn't
did say.
so
Hmm,
easy. Wasn't going to be so easy.
hmm. I did say in the past that I can't really speak to how Google Stadia performed, and that is mostly true, but I do remember hearing quite a bit about how Stadia functioned when it comes to the. Let me just turn my phone off because I've got things coming in, so I don't want that dinging. Right. I remember a lot of the criticism with Stadia originally. For example, I remember that one of the issues that was always brought up was latency issues. Now, this is an issue that's kind of plaguing um, streaming service, like the whole shtick of streaming services as a whole. Again, I brought it up in the last video when I talked about my PlayStation Plus experience, like the streaming aspect of it. Latency is a bit of an issue, which can manifest as lag. Like that really depends on how well built the infrastructure is. I believe I remember hearing that when Stadia was released, despite Google promising a very powerful infrastructure, which they did have, but it didn't manifest in the actual thing, and there was a few latency issues I remember hearing about. So there was that whole issue.
Hmm.
Excuse me. But again, that's just an issue that I think will be plaguing streaming services in general. I know one of the major issues that actually came out of Stadia was the lack of first-party games, or the lack of games. Because here's the thing, right? What are you going to need to attract game players to a new platform? What do you need to attract gamers to a new platform? You need games, obviously. Here's the thing. Where are you going to get those games? This is a nice little way for me to nail Epic as well here in a way. This is kind of the same debacle Epic kind of faced when they were trying to release the Epic Store as a competitor to Steam. Steam was the original player on the market, so everyone went to them, and for good reason. Their rates weren't exactly the kindest, but features-wise, they were the best around. Now, Epic might be able to give better rates, but at the end of the day, if they're going to snag actual buyers, then they're going to need actual good games, which is, again, where this issue comes in. When it came for Epic, that meant just basically buying out games onto their platform and basically signing exclusivity contracts to essentially force the business over to them. Google tried this, I think, but I don't think it was very effective. Like, there's still criticisms about first party games as well, right? And again, in the case of Stadia, its business model is a little different than your standard storefront. Most of the business is done purely from the whole streaming aspect of the thing. You're not selling games as your primary business model here. Yeah, you could, but most of it comes from the actual streaming service itself, so you're going to need actual games to stream. And there again lies in the whole aspect of games lineups and the whole aspect of getting games onto the platform. Like I said, Epic's solution to
Exclusivity and
this,
all that.
exclusivity on all that. And again, Epic's solution to this whole issue with their storefront was just to buy first party games and basically sign great deals to force the competition over to them. Google really didn't attempt this. They just kind of left things as is and just kind of slowly built up their catalog. The problem is this really doesn't work. And there really wasn't much games on Stadia in general. Because of this, there really wasn't much to do in the early days of Stadia, and I think even in the later days of Stadia, there still really wasn't much of a good games catalog lineup as is, so there was also that to contend with. Stadia was kind of memed on in the games industry from its inception, so
Exactly.
yeah, that didn't exactly help either. All in all, I think Stadia was very much a prototype.
Hmm.
It was Google's attempt into the games industry and their attempt at trying to basically strike it rich without really knowing how to do that.
Without actually going and figuring out what they needed to do and all that.
Yeah, in a way, this kind of harkens into an issue that a lot of these big companies that are trying to break into the industry have, which is they look at the games industry and they see metric tons of money that things like EA and Take Two and all these big companies are making, right? But they really don't do the research as to how they're going to make that money. They just think that there's money to be made. They really don't know how, though.
Yeah,
They're just
they
kind of
just
throwing
see
things
money
in.
and think, oh, I can get that, and then they think that they'll just get it by existing.
Yeah, they think they'll just walk into the market and business will flow to them. Like Amazon still has this problem themselves too, right? They came into the market with the whole idea that they're going to start creating games. But the problem is they really don't know what games they're wanting to make. They don't know what games they should make. So all they end up doing is kind of chasing trends and creating whatever's trending at that moment, which, yeah, can work if you do it right. But there's also a debate there if they can even do that much. Like New Worlds, I remember, had a mixed reception at launch and is currently either hemorrhaged players or completely lost all its players for the most part. So and I don't think there's any cult following behind New Worlds to my knowledge. So, there's that issue as well. As for what all this has to do with Stadia, it really, like I said, comes down to the whole fact that Google's entrance into the market really kind of, I want to say, kind of allowed people to enter the market that probably didn't have any business being there to begin with,
Hmm.
kind of emboldening them to be like, hey, if he can do it, we can do it. I hate to get political, but Trump is actually a very good example here. His success in an election basically proved to everyone else, hey, if he can get into politics, I can get into politics too. So, eh, it's kind of a similar scenario here. I think the political banter is kind of on point, but regardless, Stadia itself is an interesting piece. As I said, it was a prototype. Just because that game streaming service kind of went by the wayside, I don't believe this is the end of streaming services as a whole. It's just the end of Google's attempts as a streaming service. Will they continue being in the games industry though?
Who
That's actually
knows?
an interesting point. Who knows? Yeah, who knows? To my knowledge, Google hasn't made any real attempts into the games industry outside of Google Stadia as their big main push. I mean, they've got like phone gaming, which like they have the VR thing, but that's more of a side project, not even on par with Stadia. It's more of just a almost like a pet project for them. So,
Hmm.
but then again, isn't everything Google does kind of a pet project? So,
There's that.
yeah, there is that. Like I said, will we see Google back in the games industry? It's possible, though I think they'll probably be licking their wounds for at least a little bit before they try something else. All in all, I think the people who probably lost the most here were the people who bought into Stadia from the beginning.
Yeah, the people who are like using it and all that.
I remember there was the Founders Pack going around when it first came out, like the Founders Pack, or Founders Edition. I think it was Founders Pack. And it was pretty pricey too. I think it was like several $100. So,
Well,
you
it's not
know,
cheap.
it was not cheap, no. So, Did those people get their money's worth out of it? Maybe, maybe not. There might be some ramifications for that, though. Again, this is kind of a like a commentary on streaming services as a whole, right? Streaming services, buying games and buying games physically all have different levels of ownership to them, right? When you buy a game physically, you put money down on that game and you physically own it. If you have the disc, then you physically own a copy of that game, or maybe a majority copy of that game. And the reason I say that is because day one patches these days are basically the entire game and then some nowadays. But
Yeah. Like,
discounting that fact,
we forgot this little feature. Don't mind this here
20
20
gigabyte patch.
28 kilogram of downloading power. Yeah. Don't mind this.
Yeah. Don't mind this, like, you buy like a 38 gigabyte game. Don't mind the 20 gigabytes that come day one as a patch. That's basically more than half the game. But, so yeah. Like, discounting that, there's the level of ownership where you own the game physically. There's also when you buy on marketplaces like Steam and, again, the aforementioned Epic games, where you own the license to the game. You don't own a physical copy, but you own the license to access that game. So you still own something related to that game specifically. Though if there's ever a recall of that game, you must be compensated for it. But streaming services are a bit of a, I could say, gray area, because there really is no level of ownership over the specific games you're playing.
Basically, here I can give a good example for a streaming service. For anyone who uses Steam, this will kind of make sense. Streaming services like Stadia are kind of like Steam, where you buy it in a way a digital copy of it. But in this case of streaming services, it's more of you buy a digital copy that you are able to use, but you don't really have that copy with you. Like with Steam, you can go and you can buy a digital copy and you can just download it on whatever devices you want. So, in other words, you can play that game on as many devices as you want, just as long as you know your login credentials to get into the account in the first place. Stadia is different in the case where, yeah, you have that digital copy, but that is literally it. If you go offline, if you do anything that doesn't give you a direct connection to the server itself, you do not have the means to actually play that game. And you don't really download the game either, so it's you have internet connection or you don't play at all.
Yeah. And again, there's that whole factor of ownership too, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you buy a game physically, you own a disc physically. When you buy a license to a game, you own the license, which has a little less ownership to it, but there's still that level of compensation you have to be given should the game ever get yanked from shelves or should something change up in the contract. Again, there's a whole story we talked about in the last video surrounding all of this around Slime Rancher and how that was had a bit of a debacle surrounding it.
I
Surrounding
don't
its
think it was
potential.
Slime Rancher, but yeah.
It might have been Slime Rancher. I think it might have been. I'll have to go check this.
I really don't think so because Slime Rancher had a pretty niche development cycle out of anything. Like, I know a few games that have had like a really harsh development cycle, and Slime Rancher
Oh, it has
hasn't.
nothing to do with the device development cycle. It was the fact that, like, originally it was promised for, essentially, if memory serves, the story went like this. It was a crowdfunded game to begin with.
Hmm.
Originally, it was going to be put on Steam because that was what people who backed the game promised. Unfortunately, Epic stepped into the picture to basically buy up the game and force it onto their platform with an exclusivity contract. That violated what they basically promised to their backers, and they kind of said, eh? So they had to strike a deal with Steam to kind of have both ways because, yes, they had to honor their contract with Epic for the exclusivity because they were promising more money they could make on the backing, but they also promised people who backed the game and gave money access to a Steam version, which, because of the exclusivity contract, no longer exists or was not going to no longer exist. So there was a whole backlash from that.
Yeah.
But regardless, when it comes to streaming services and how they operate, there are some streaming services, and I think Google did have this maybe, where you could buy games from the streaming services. But for the most part, most of the games, like 99% of them, were just there. Like you streamed them. You have no ownership of that game whatsoever. So again, let's say the game was yanked from Stadia because, let's say, aforementioned legal issues. There would be nothing you could really say or no ramification or remuneration you could demand from Stadia because you have no money on that game specifically. You buy into the streaming service, not the games themselves. So they could change up their entire catalog, and there'd really be nothing you could say or argue demanding for changing things up. Like, for example, if my copy of Destiny got yanked from Steam, Steam would owe me several $100s because that is the amount I've sunk into Destiny that I can remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, like you
Versus,
actually pay for that on Steam. Like you pay directly for it. So
right. So they would either have to refund me or do something around those lines. Versus if I were to have that happen on Stadia, well, if I didn't buy any DLCs or anything, there'd really be nothing they could say. Because again, I don't own anything, not even a license to Destiny when you're on a streaming service. So even the free to play stature where they'll give you a license to play regardless doesn't exist because again, you're not buying into it anyway. Technically every game on a streaming service is free to play because you don't own it. You don't have to pay whatever
you
entrance
don't
fee
have
the
a
game
single
developers
stake
have
in it
set.
all.
Yeah, you don't have to pay whatever entrance fee, if there is any, again in the case of Destiny, that the developers have set for you to acquire the license to play the game. So there is that whole issue of ownership, which again has to do with which again is just a flaw of streaming services in general. It's kind of the old adage, you trade security for convenience in many ways, and again, streaming services are no different from that. Overall, like I said, Google Stadia is a prototype, and we're probably going to see more streaming services in the future. That is seems to be the way the industry is moving. It's a lucrative business model if they can get it right. PlayStation's already been in the market for a while. Xbox has kind of been in the market for a while. I think they're still working on their Project X Cloud, which is somewhere in development. I still have to check where that is. As for Google, like I said, will we see them again in the market? Maybe, maybe not. I I personally wouldn't wager on it though. Like I said, Google is a company that throws things to the wall and just sees what sticks. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. No real loss on them.
Yeah,
This
they
was
they tend to back off a lot of the time once when they're like, this doesn't seem like it's gonna work. I'm just gonna move on.
pretty much. So, will we see them again? I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I also wouldn't wager on it either.
I wouldn't put like $1,000 on it. They might come back like maybe some point way down the line, but I wouldn't bet on it anytime soon.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the end of Google Stadia. What do you think, Justin? Was it worth it in the end?
To anyone who did get Stadia, not really. I honestly would say no. I am always going to be a very either go with Steam or go with hard copy.
Mm, yeah. I'm very traditional as well. I prefer hard copies.
Hmm.
That's not to say I don't see the merit in streaming. Like I said, I do think there is merit to it, and I have again talked about the benefits and the problems, but again, it's where the industry is going, so yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's
It is
that.
the future of gaming. But yeah, so overall I kind of wonder what will happen to those who bought into Stadia in the beginning. Do they think, I mean, again, it will depend from person to person if they think they got their money's worth. Some probably will say yes, others maybe not. Again, it really depends on what they bought into Stadia originally for anyway. Some
Hmm.
might have been doing it because it was the hot new thing. Others might have been doing it because they legitimately saw the convenience of it. Again, it really
Like
depends on why you
like
bought into it to begin
no
with.
matter what, the one number one thing that I will always see its convenience for is the fact that storage is not an issue. Like
Yeah, that's kind of one of the
like
big selling points for streaming.
that's the biggest thing. Like a guy like me, I have like an entire terabyte where I can go and put whatever I want into this one drive. But even then, that fills up very quickly because there's a lot of games that can be 100 or more gigabytes So,
That's true.
like
That is becoming a thing.
it fills up fast. So if you like to play a lot of very big name games, hopefully you enjoy downloading and reinstalling things all the time.
Hmm. Or not having very many games and just having those few big games on your drive.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, storage has always been a big selling point for streaming services. It's probably one of the reasons they gain traction among their users. But like I said, when it comes to if Stadia was worth the effort and the buying power and the purchase price, like I said, I think it really will depend on how, like, when you stepped into Stadia and why you stepped into Stadia. If you were one of the people who stepped into it from the beginning, there's a much higher chance you probably had some more use out of it than someone who stepped into it, say, I don't know, 3, 4 months ago,
Yeah.
when there was still only just rumors, I think, of it going down. And even then, if you went into it because it's just like the new thing,
I
eh.
mean, I could understand some people going into it like to just try it out, see like exactly what it was for themselves to get like go and have their own opinion, like proper opinion of it. Cuz you can go and like have an opinion on it, but you can't really have a full-on opinion if you haven't tried it. Like I don't know
Yeah.
about Nick, but I haven't tried it myself at all, period. So I don't really know to the exact extent on how it would perform under my standards.
It
So,
really depended on ping, I remember hearing. Again, I can't speak too much about the personal side of it
hmm.
because I personally never tried it, but I've read enough articles to get the gist of Maple's criticisms. I can speak on streaming services at least because I, like I said, have been at least attempting those.
Yeah.
So I can kind of take to those. But again, overall, it was an attempt. It was a prototype. We'll see how it goes. Like I said, this is not the end of streaming services by a long shot. This is just probably the end of Google's attempts at it. I
Probably.
remember the old Stadia commercials, actually. Those are, well, I say old. They were only from like 2 years ago, 3 years ago at this
Yeah,
point.
it was like not very long ago. Like it was pretty much around the time when we started college that Stadia was really
Hmm.
kicking off. So that was
Yeah, it
like
was like
about like
2019.
4 years ago.
Yeah, 3 years ago, 3, 4 years ago, something like that.
Yeah.
So it was only about 3, 4 years since Stadia released that Stadia closed down. Eh, like I said, they stuck with it longer than I think most people thought Google was willing to do it. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
because sunk cost, maybe because they thought they could get it to work if they stick with it long enough, but
Who
I don't
knows?
know. Maybe when you started to see the commercials on TV for Stadia ramp down, did you start seeing Google like executives perhaps losing faith in the program?
Don't know.
I'm pretty sure there might have been like a few diehards at Google who were trying to keep it going, but
Probably knowing Google, there's always a good number of people who are part of a project who are like, "Oh no, we got to keep this going."
mm,
So who knows?
which is probably the most like which for those kind of people working at Google must be terrible.
Hmm.
Because they never stick with the project for long enough for it to work, so I'm guessing executives really don't care about the sentiment.
It's like we're moving on. No, please don't do this to me. I've already bounced to 3 other projects. Please don't.
Yeah. Again, it's all about the bottom line for Google, and I think, like I said, the only reason they stuck with it for so long is because maybe they thought they could make it work and make a ton of money off it, which didn't end up happening.
Yep.
So, anyways, yeah, that's Stadia's retrospective. It was an attempt. It was an honest, oh, maybe not an honest attempt. Well, no, maybe at streaming services, though perhaps not from the company that should have been doing it. I mean, the whole reason Google got into it in the beginning is because their original selling point was that since they're Google, they had the infrastructure to make it work, which, in fairness, wasn't wrong, at least not entirely, but I don't know if they were the company to do it because they really, like, infrastructure wise, I guess they weren't bad, but they didn't know what exactly to work on beyond infrastructure, right? Like, here's some advice to Google in the future if they ever hear this. If you're going to enter the games industry, do it from a technical backup perspective. Like, do it as a, hey, we'll provide you the hardware perspective. Let someone else do the actual game management side because you guys don't really know what you're doing in that regard. I'm just going to be blunt. You don't really have any experience in that regard. So, if you were to say provide architecture or backup architecture to someone like PlayStation or Xbox's xCloud when they start doing that, that would be much more up your alley than running the whole show yourself.
Hmm.
That would just be my personal advice as a businessman, my 2 cents. But what does my opinion matter to a multi-billion-dollar corporation?
What does the singular opinion matter
So
versus the
yeah,
collective?
versus the collective of a multinational corporation.
Yes.
But yeah, so that's Google Stadia. That's where it was. That's where it's at, or was at, and that's that. So yeah, that's this week's episode.
Hmm. Hopefully you enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully this will be a video this time. I know last week our video kind of glitched. We released something last week, but it was under the stream tab, so
Yes, blame YouTube because YouTube likes to separate everything out now, and for some reason can't just keep, user accessibility and ease of use a thing. They need to make things quote unquote easier to use. So, yeah.
which is also another thing we can nail Google for because Google owns YouTube. So haha. Anyways.
Yes.
But
Google.
anyways.
Failure.
Anyways, for the sake of length, we won't drag this out too much.
No.
So anyways, see you all next week. See you all next Monday. Hopefully we have another topic by then. We actually were bouncing around 2 topics today. 3 technically, but who knows what we'll do next week.
Well, we'll be doing something every
Well,
week
always.
like we always do, so don't worry, everyone.
Oh yeah. Anyways, ciao everyone. Have a good night.
And don't mind me throwing random body parts with crystals outside of sticking in and outside of them into a burning fire. It is fine. This is perfectly sanitary.
And weirdly on brand. Weirdly on brand considering the topic.
Yes.
It's like this is what we're doing with Stadia's body parts. We're just burning them at this point.
It is all going into the fire.
It is all going into the fire. There is nothing left to bury.
Here, you know what? I'll make this easier and just get out of the laser. Yes, barbecue.
Hope you like your flesh. Well done. Sorry that there's a weak constitution. Have a good night, everyone.